Original dialogues, advanced astrology, roundtable discussions on symbol, structure, and sky. These are 5 conversations among 5 invented practitioners, each holding a distinct technical lineage constructed to stage the genuine fault lines of the field. Symbol versus mechanism, tropical versus sidereal, midpoint versus aspect, chart versus cycle. Before we get started, I really want to give a shout out to Report Labs and my AI agent that helped craft this video, or technically the PDF, because I give the idea and then we get the PDF result with my idea fully fledged out. So I usually say in the description which tool I used as well to make it very clear. Report Labs, shout out with technical notes, diagrams, and a glossary. So we see this table of discussions is going to involve a preface on the method of compendium and why the round table is invented, the grammar of symbol, archetype, mechanism, and what a planet is supposed to mean, harmonics in the midpoint lattice, Eberton's arithmetic and the harmonic chart of John Eddy, the Ayanamsa question, tropical seasons versus sidereal constellations in the 24 degrees cap, fixed stars in the Paran's helical risings and return of a classical technique, mundane cycles in the outer planets, Saturn, Pluto, Saturn, Neptune, and reading history and synodic time, as well as a glossary of the technical terms, a working reference for terms used across all 5 discussions. So here's a quick preface here on the shape of this book. The 5 practitioners who speak in this volume, of course, do not exist. Mara Vosculi, Theo Brandt, Sumida Nair, Casimir Reyes. That was really loud. I'm so sorry, guys. Casimir Reyes and Odayo Asante are original characters, each built to carry one technical lineage to its most articulate, most defensible edge, and then to put that edge against the others in direct conversation. And this is going to be the choice to invent rather than convene. An actual panel is deliberate. Let each position be stated at full strength without the diplomatic softening that real disagreement usually acquires, while the astrological techniques, historical claims, and footnoted sources referenced throughout are drawn from the documented record of the field. Astrology is treated here neither as settled science nor as a target for debunking, but as a long-running symbolic and technical tradition with real internal disagreements about what a chart is calculating, what accuracy would even mean for it, and how much of its authority rests on psychological usefulness versus claimed predictive mechanism. The footnotes exist to keep the technical claims, orbs, cycle lengths, historical attributions pinned to something checkable, even where the interpretive claims built on top of them are frankly speculative. Each discussion opens with a diagram, proceeds with a dialogue, and closes with numbered notes. Read in order, the 5 conversations move from the innermost question, what does the symbol mean, to the outermost, what do long planetary cycles mean for collectives, with technique in between doing the load-bearing work. So the first discussion is the grammar of symbol, archetype, mechanism, and what a planet is supposed to mean, with Myra Foscuil, symbolist, archetypal and psychological astrology, Theo Brandt, technicalist, Uranian midpoints in harmonics, Casimir Reyes, historicist, classical, and Hellenistic revivalist. So a planet is not a fact about the sky, it is a claim about what the sky is for. Opening provocation. For discussion 1, we see setting the terms. Myra, I want to start by refusing the premise that we're arguing about whether astrology works. That framing assumes a single mechanism we could test. What I practice is closer to an archetypal grammar. Saturn doesn't cause restriction. Saturn is our name for the experience of encountering a limit. Casimir. That's a modern move and a fairly late one. The Hellenistic tradition I work from treats the planets as having dynamis, powers, with documented rulerships, sex status, and condition. Malefic and benefic were not metaphors to Vidyas villains. They were operational categories you calculated with. Theo. And I'd push both of you towards something more falsifiable, even if it's still symbolic. The Hamburg School's claim isn't mystical, it's structural. A midpoint is a literal, angular relationship. Sun Saturn equals Mars is arithmetic before its archetype. Whether the interpretation holds is a separate question from whether the structure is real. Where the disagreement actually sits. Voskuil leans forward, unconvinced that arithmetic settles anything. The structure being real doesn't make the reading true, Theo. You can always find a midpoint close enough to a planet in a full chart. With 10 bodies and a few degrees of orb, hits are nearly guaranteed. That's a statistical property of the method, not evidence for it. Which is exactly why Eberton restricted the midpoint tree to hard aspects and tight orbs, typically under 2 degrees, and why the 90 degrees dial exists at all. It's a discipline against exactly the overfitting you're describing. Not a license for it. I note that both of your frameworks are recent by the standards of the field. Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, 2nd century CE, already systematizes planetary dynamics through sect, dignity, and aspect without needing a 90 degrees dial or an archetypal unconscious. Novelty isn't refinement. Sometimes it's just drift from the load-bearing technique. A working distinction. Let me try a synthesis, not a surrender. I think what separates us is where each of us locates the authority of a reading. Casimir puts it in the preserved technical corpus, Theo puts it in structural precision, and I put it in psychological resonance. Does a symbol organize a person's actual experience? None of those are the same claim, and I don't think they're required to agree. Agreed on the diagnosis, not the conclusion. If they don't agree, one of us should be willing to say the others are doing something other than astrology in the sense the tradition originally meant. Where the tradition has always been 3 traditions wearing one name, and the Roundtable is just where that finally becomes visible. Here we see triplicities in their aspects. So the 12 sign wheel with triplicity element coding and an inner lattice showing all trine and square relationships across the circle. The geometric skeleton each speaker interprets differently. Closing positions. In the closing position, the planet is a symbol whose validity is psychological. I don't need Saturn to do anything to find the symbol clinically useful. Theo says, mind structure first. If the angular relationship isn't real and repeatable across a chart set, no amount of psychological resonance rescues the technique. And Casimir says, mind, technique inherited from a documented lineage carries an evidentiary weight that an individually invented framework does not prove but a different kind of warrant. And notes the term follows Dane Rudar's 20th century reframing of astrology as a symbolic humanistic language rather than a predictive mechanism. As you can see is the Astrology of Personality from 1936. This footnote reports Rudar's documented position. It does not attribute any quotation to him. Betis Valens Anthology is a primary source for Hellenistic technical astrology, including sect, day-night charts, and planetary conditions. See Schmidt's Project Hindsight translations. This is a version of the general critique that dense symbol sets with generous orbs produce near certain coincidental hits. It mirrors arguments raised by Jeffrey Dean and others in statistical evaluations of astrological technique. For example, Dean and Kelly, is astrology relevant to consciousness and psi in the Journal of Consciousness Studies? Reinhold Eberton, combination of stellar influences, formalized the 90 degree style, and tight orb midpoint method within the German Hamburg School, Cosmobiology, founded by Alfred Wright, and Claudius Ptolemy, Tetrabiblos, books 1-2, sets out essential dignity, sect, and aspect doctrine that predates both Jungian and Uranian frameworks by roughly 18 centuries. The second discussion is harmonics in the midpoint lattice, Eberton's arithmetic in the harmonic charts of John Addy. We have Theo Brandt, Sumida Nair, who's a Vedic lineage geotisha methodology specialist, Odail Asante, who's a mundane analyst, cycles, markets, and collectives. And I see that every aspect is a fraction. The question is only which denominator the chart insists on. This is a working note. So from aspect to harmonic, we begin with Theo. Start from what a harmonic chart actually is. Multiply every longitude by n and replot. The fourth harmonic recovers the hard aspect family, square opposition. The ninth recovers the trine family through different lens. Addy's claim was that the whole aspect system is a special case of harmonic resonance, not the other way around. Sumita says, which is elegant, but it walks straight past the question Jyotisha never lets you skip. Harmonic of which zodiac? A ninth harmonic chart that Navamsha is central to Vedic technique, but it's built on the sidereal longitude, not the tropical one you're defaulting to. And Theo says, fair. The arithmetic is zodiac agnostic. It's a reference frame that isn't. I'll grant that a harmonic built on the wrong frame just reproduces the frame's error at a different multiple. So does cycle length change the reading? Dial says, this is where I'd bring in the mundane angle. When I'm reading a Saturn-Pluto cycle for collective timing, I don't especially care whether we call the exact conjunction a first harmonic event or anything else. What matters is where we sit inside a roughly 33 through 38 year period and what phase of that period historically correlates with what kind of event cluster. Theo says that's actually a harmonic claim too, though you're treating the full cycle as a fundamental and reading conjunction, square, opposition as the first, fourth, and second harmonic divisions of that period rather than of the individual birth chart. It's the same arithmetic at a different time scale. Sumita says, which is a genuinely nice observation. Dot periods and Vedic timing work the same way. Cycles nested inside cycles, each division treated as meaningful in its own right rather than as noise around a single signal. And here we see a worked Sun Saturn equals Mars midpoint structure. Mars stands on the arithmetic midpoint of Sun and Saturn. And the configuration the Hamburg School reads as fused drive and limitation. So Mars stands upon a Sun-Saturn midpoint. The drive Mars is fused with the eco-structure axis. Notice that Sun's at 14 degrees Capricorn, 20 degrees Sagittarius, our star is right where that midpoint is, and Saturn at 26 degrees Scorpio, and Mars at 21 degrees Sag. So a disagreement that doesn't resolve. Theo says, I don't think Sumita and I actually converge here, to be honest. I'm comfortable with the birth chart as a fundamental unit and everything else as harmonic derivation from it. Sumita says, and I'd say the divisional charts aren't derivations from a fundamental. In the tradition I practice, several of them, like the Dashamsha for career, I read with an authority close to the Rashi natal chart itself, not as a secondary lens on it. Odile says, which is, from where I sit, the more useful posture for mundane work anyway. There isn't one fundamental cycle in collective life. There are several running concurrently, and pretending one is primary is usually how a forecaster gets blindsided by the one they weren't tracking. Some notes here. See John Addy, Harmonics in Astrology, generalize the traditional aspect set as low-numbered harmonics of the birth longitudes, building on earlier work by the astrologer and researcher John Nelson, and more distantly on Kepler's harmonic cosmology. The Navamsha D9 divisional chart is one of the classical Shodasha Varga 16 divisional charts, described in Parashara as Brihat Parashara Horashastra, and is computed from sidereal Narayana longitudes throughout the Vedic tradition. The Saturn-Pluto synodic period averages approximately 33 to 38 years, owing to Pluto's eccentric orbit. Conjunctions have occurred in, among other years, 1914, 1947 through 48, and 1982. January 2020, the Vimshottari Dasha system divides a 120-year cycle among the 9 grahas in fixed proportional periods, with each Mahadasha further subdivided into Antardashas, a nested cycle timing technique with no direct equivalent in Western tropical astrology. Excuse me. The Dashamsha D10 governing career and public standing is likewise part of the classical divisional chart set and is treated by many Vedic practitioners as carrying independent interpretive weight rather than functioning purely as a derivative overlay. Discussion 3. The Ayanamsa question. So tropical seasons versus sidereal constellations in the 24 degrees gap. Sumita, Yazimir, Myra. Precession did not break the zodiac, it only forced every zodiac to say out loud what it was measuring. Here's a primary mark. 2 0 points. Sumita says the core fact isn't in dispute. The equinox precesses against the fixed stars at roughly 50.3 arcseconds a year, a full cycle in about 25,772 years. Tropical astrology defines Aries 0 degrees at the equinox itself, which drifts against the constellations. Sidereal astrology, the tradition I use, anchors to the constellation backdrop and lets the seasonal correlation drift instead. So Casimir says, in the tropical framework isn't a modern evasion of that fact. Ptolemy explicitly chose a tropical frame in the 2nd century, arguing the zodiac's meaning was seasonal, tied to the sun's relationship to the earth, not stellar. So this isn't sidereal as original, tropical as drift. Both are ancient choices made for different reasons. Mara says, which is honestly the more interesting fact that either technical camp usually lays with. The disagreement is 1800 plus years old and was never a rounding error. It's a real fork about what the zodiac is for. Here we see tropical wheel, solid seasonal against the sidereal frame, which is gold, constellation anchored, separated by an illustrative 24 degrees Ayanamsa, the accumulated precessional offset. So fixed versus moving. We see tropical, 0 degrees Aries equals vernal equinox point fixed to the seasons each year. Sidereal, 0 degrees Aries anchored to the visible constellation, drifting from the tropical frame by 50.3 arc minutes per year. Arc seconds per year. Precession of the equinoxes. And Ayanamsa, tropical season. Beginning right there, Aries. So, which Ayanamsa and why it matters. Even inside sidereal practice, this isn't settled. The Lahiri Ayanamsa, which is the Indian government's official standard, differs by roughly a degree from the Krishnamurti or Raman Ayanamsas, which changes house cusps enough to shift a planet sign near a boundary. Which is structurally the same problem the tropical camp has with house systems. Placidus, whole sign, Cook, Regiomontanus all reassign angles differently, near the poles especially, and none of them is neutral either. So neither of your traditions gets to claim the other is arbitrary, while its own internal choice of Ayanamsa or house system is somehow not arbitrary in the same way. I'd only push back slightly. The sidereal Ayanamsas at least converge within about a degree of each other around a shared reference. The position of the star spica historically, the house system disagreement in Western practice is a wider spread with less convergence on any anchor at all. Practical stakes. Concretely, a person born with the sun at 29 degrees Pisces tropical sits around 5 degrees Pisces sidereal under Lahiri. Same birth, same instant, 2 different sun signs by a full month of the ordinary zodiac calendar. Which is precisely why I tell clients the tropical sidereal split isn't a footnote. It's a single fact most likely to make 2 astrologers and the same person 2 different charts. And here we see the precession of the equinoxes first systematically measured by Hipparchus and later refined proceeds at approximately 50.29 arc seconds per year, completing one full cycle in roughly 25,772 years, a so-called great year or Platonic year. Ptolemy Tetrabiblos 110 explicitly defends the tropical starting point on the grounds that the zodiacal qualities, heat, moisture, and their seasonal analogs originate from the sun's relation to the earth, not from the background stars. The Lahiri Shitra Paksha Ayanamsa was adopted by the Indian government's Calendar Reform Committee in 1955 and remains the most widely used standard in Vedic astrology. The Krishnamurti and B.V. Raman Ayanamsas are alternative calculations differing by roughly half a degree to just over a degree, depending on epoch. Placidus, Cook, and Regiomontanus are all-time base quadrant house systems that become mathematically unstable or undefined at high latitudes. Pole sign houses, by contrast, assign each entire zodiac sign as one house and were the dominant system in Hellenistic practice before quadrant systems became standard in medieval Europe. Alright, and discussion 4. Fixed stars on the Parans, helical risings, and the return of a classical technique. Casimir, Odile, Theo. A star does not move through the houses, you move under the star. This is the field note for this discussion. What a Paran actually measures. And really quick, I'm going to get some water because my throat is dry as fuck. to go. What a Baron actually measures. So Casimir says, a Baron isn't a longitude aspect at all. It's a simultaneity of angularity. Two bodies, Paran, when one is rising while the other culminates, for instance, at the specific latitude of the birth. Change the latitude, the Paran can dissolve entirely because it depends on the local horizon and the meridian, not on ecliptic degree. Theo says, which is a genuinely different kind of technique from anything we've discussed so far. Midpoints and harmonics are ecliptic longitude arithmetic. A Paran is closer to spherical astronomy and needs the birth latitude, not just the date and time. Odile says, and for mundane work, that's exactly the appeal. A nation's chart or an event chart is pinned to a real place, so latitude-dependent technique isn't a complication. It's the whole point. A Baron active at one capital city and not another can be read as geographically specific signature. Heliacal risings. The related classical technique is the heliacal rising. The first morning the star becomes visible again after being lost in the sun's glare. Egyptian and later Hellenistic calendars use Sirius's heliacal rising as a fixed calendrical marker. Remembering that Sirius is a fixed star, it's arguably the oldest continuously tracked star-based technique in the tradition. Theo says, I'll admit that's a more empirically grounded technique than most of what we discussed in the harmonics conversation. A heliacal rising is an actual observable event, not an interpretive overlay on a computed chart. Odile says, which is maybe the through line across all four distinct discussions so far. The techniques that survive scrutiny best are usually the ones tied to something locally observable, a real horizon, a real cycle length, rather than a purely computed abstraction. Casimir says, I'd only note that's a claim about evidentiary comfort, not about interpretive value. The heliacal rising being observable doesn't by itself tell you what a given rising means for a chart. That part is still the same kind of symbolic judgment Meyer was defending in the first discussion. Notes here, the Paran from Greek paranatelon, rising beside, is documented in Hellenistic sources including Vitus Valens and was substantially revived for needlework by Robert Hahn and independently by Bernadette Brady in Brady's book of Fixed Stars. The heliacal rising of Sirius, Sothis, was used by ancient Egyptian astronomer priests to anchor the civil calendar and anticipate the Nile flood. The technique and its calendrical role are discussed in Nugabar, A History of Ancient Mathematical Astronomy. And discussion 5 is mundane cycles, the outer planets. I'm talking about Saturn, Pluto, Saturn, Neptune, and reading history and synodic time. We have Odile, Sumida, Myra. History does not repeat its events. Astrologers claim it repeats its intervals. It's the closing provocation. Here's the case for cycle rating. Dial says, mundane astrology's central claim is modest compared to natal work. Not that a specific outer planet alignment causes a specific event, but that recurring alignments correlate with recurrent kinds of period. Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, roughly every 36 years, with periods of disillusionment or the collapse of an overextended structure being a commonly cited pattern. Myra says, which is a much more defensible claim. Structurally, this event was caused by this transit. It's closer to seasonal reasoning. Not every November is identical, but there's a real pattern to what Novembers tend to bring. Seasonal depression for a lot of people. Sumida, it also maps onto something Vedic mundane technique does independently. The Varshapal, or annual tarkas, for the solar return of a nation or entity, is read for the year's character rather than for a single predicted event, which is the same epistemic move Odile is describing. So here we see a schematic synodic timeline. Markers show conjunction points for 4 Saturn outer planet cycles across a 40-year illustrative span, showing how differently the cycles nest against one another. So we started at 0, go into 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, and 40. And these are the years elapsed schematic. So we see Jupiter-Saturn lasting 20 years, we see Saturn, Uranus, right at the 0 point. Saturn, Neptune, right in between. It looks like 35 actually it's heading. And Saturn, Pluto, probably about 33, 34. So here are the limits everyone concedes. Where I want to be careful, mundane astrology has a well-documented problem with retrospective pattern matching. You can always find an event in a 2 to 3 year window around a major conjunction, because major conjunctions are common and history is dense with events. The technique is much weaker prospectively than it looks in a well-chosen retrospective case study, which is the same overfitting problem I raised about midpoints in the first discussion, just at a collective scale instead of an individual one. Agreed, and it's part of why serious mundane practitioners lean heavily on ingress charts, solstice, and equinox charts cast for capital alongside the long cycles, rather than reading a single conjunction in isolation. So where the 5 discussions leave us? I don't think we converged on a shared theory across these 5 conversations, and I'd be suspicious of a compendium that claimed we had. What we converged on, if anything, is a shared standard for what counts as a serious technical claim within each tradition. Checkable cycle lengths, documented lineage, latitude-specific calculation, even where the interpretive layer built on top of that structure remains by nature a matter of symbolic judgment rather than settled fact. Which might be the most honest closing note this compendium could offer. The technique can be rigorous. What the technique is claimed to mean is a separate question, and every speaker in this book has answered it differently. And these notes. Saturn-Neptune synodic cycle. It averages approximately 36 years. Conjunctions occurred in, among other years, 1917, 1953, 1989, 2026. Though the interpretive association with disillusionment themes is a traditional mundane astrology claim, not an independently verified statistical finding. Varshafal annual solar return technique, detailed in texts such as the Tijika Nila Kanti. Cast a chart for the moment the sun returns to its natal degree and reads it for the general character of the coming year, rather than for a discrete predicted event. Ingress charts cast for the moment the sun enters a cardinal sign, typically for our nation's capital, are a documented complementary mundane technique, discussed for instance in Charles Carter's An Introduction to Political Astrology. And here is a glossary of technical terms. So the Ayanamsa is the angular offset between the tropical and sidereal zodiacs at a given date, resulting from the precession of the equinoxes. Commonly cited values sit near 24 degrees in the early 21st century, depending on which Ayanamsa standard is used. We see Dasha in Vedic astrology, planetary time period system, most commonly Vimshatara Dasha, that divides life into sequential nested periods ruled by different grahas used for timing events. Harmonic chart, a derived chart in which every longitude is multiplied by an integer n and reduced to 0 through 360 degrees, used to expose aspect families, for example, the fourth harmonic for squares and oppositions. Ingress chart, a chart cast for the exact moment the sun enters a cardinal sign, so Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn, typically located for a capital city and used in mundane forecasting. Midpoint, the arithmetic mid-longitude between two bodies. In Hamburg School Cosmobiology technique, a third body occupying a midpoint, as well as combining the symbolism of both. Puran, a latitude-dependent relationship in which one body is angular, rising, setting, culminating, or anti-culminating at the same moment as another, central to classical fixed star technique. Sect and Hellenistic astrology, the classification of a chart as diurnal or nocturnal, which changes which planets are considered more favorably or unfavorably disposed. Synodic cycle, the period between successive conjunctions of two bodies as seen from Earth, used in mundane astrology to structure long-range historical and forecasting claims. And at Varshafal, the Vedic solar return technique, a chart cast for the moment the sun returns to its exact natal degree, right for the character of the coming year. So all roundtable dialogue in this compendium is original and attributed to invented characters. Historical figures, texts, and techniques cited in the numbered notes are referenced for their documented positions and publications. No quotation is attributed to a real historical person. With peace and love, I'll see you in the next video. Bye, see you out.